For this session, we're going to venture into the world of CSS. I've started with just a basic HTML skeleton. I have already saved it to what will be my root folder. And we're going to start by simply getting a good definition, first of all, of what CSS is. First of all, it stands for Cascading Style Sheets. And it can really be thought of several things. First of all, it's a file extension. So you could have a file that you might call style.css. Okay, the .css makes it a file extension. Essentially, this is a code. It's a set of code. It's a language, sort of like HTML, that allows us to define styles and put visual aspects to them. For example, we could redefine our heading 1, our H1 tag. We could give it a style of a font face of Arial. We could give it a color of red. We could give it a size of 32 pixels. We can make it bold. And that would essentially redefine that style. So heading 1 would no longer be Times New Roman in some random size that a browser interprets. It would have a very distinct look. Now, we can write CSS rules in several places. We can put them here in our HTML. We can put them in their own CSS file, which we'll do later. But for this session, I really just want to focus on applying some very, very basic CSS properties and values, and really just try to get the terminology down. So, to start, I'm going to drop in a few paragraphs. I'll run out to my favorite browser, and I'm going to go to lipsum.com. I'm going to scroll down and hit generate and copy. Let's do 3 paragraphs here. I'm going to copy 3 paragraphs. And I'm going to drop those 3 paragraphs in. I will go ahead and put a P tag, a paragraph tag, around each one of these. I'll go ahead and do my 3 opening paragraphs, and then I'll drop in my 3 closing paragraphs. So we're putting paragraph tags around each of our 3 paragraphs. Now if we save this at this point, look at this in our favorite browser. It's not going to look like much. Okay, we have 3 text paragraphs, which we've done several times at this point. Now, I would like to style these. I'd like to give it a certain font, a certain color, or some visual aspect. And to do that, I really have to go and create a CSS rule. Now, we'll look at CSS over several lessons, but for today, I'd like to go ahead and put my CSS in the head tag in something called the style tag. Now, the style tag is something that almost always goes up in the head at the top of our document. You can put it before or after the title. It really doesn't matter. Typically goes after. And the style tag is simply a place where you can write CSS rules directly here within our HTML. Now this is kind of a strange concept because HTML is its own language. We've gotten used to its syntax a little bit. But now we're about to start a second language. CSS has its own syntax. If you're not familiar with the word syntax, it's a good word to learn here. Syntax is sort of like the order of which computer code is written. Think of it as grammar for code. You know, the word grammar with the English language sort of insinuates that we can do proper things like punctuation, capitalization, commas, apostrophes, quotes, semicolons. All of that is involved with grammar. With computer code, we call it syntax. You know, if I ask you what's the syntax of HTML like, you would tell me that it's involved with brackets and opening and closing tags, that a closing tag would have a slash on it. That's what makes it a closing tag. That's all part of the syntax. So we're used to brackets and slashes and equal signs and a few other things, but the syntax for CSS is much, much different. Syntax for CSS involves curly brackets and dots and pound signs. It's just a different language altogether. So I'm going to create my first rule, my first CSS rule. And you can call this just about anything you want, with a few exceptions. I'm going to call this para 1. Para 1. I'm going to start it with a dot para1. And let's go ahead and write out a few things, and then I'll go back and explain each part of our CSS rule. So dot para1, and then an opening curly bracket. I'm going to drop down a couple of lines and put a closing curly bracket. The rest of our code for this definition will go between these two curly brackets. I'm going to put 3 properties and values in here. The first is going to be font family, and I'm going to say Arial. It's a common font that just about everybody has. I'm going to put font size, and I'll put 16px for 16 pixels. That'll be very large. And lastly, I'll drop in color, and I'll put #369. That's going to be a blue. I've seen that from experience, but we'll talk about how that number is comprised here in just a few moments. Now, as a whole, let's talk about this CSS rule. A rule is collectively all of this. A rule is all of this. This is all referred to as a CSS rule. The rule is broken down into several parts, and I'll put this in just kind of as notes. This isn't real code, but it'll at least make sense to us. The first part of a CSS rule is called the selector. The selector is sort of like the name of the CSS rule. It's the title. Now, there's several types of selectors. For today, we're just going to deal with the one that's got a dot in it, and that's called, that makes this a class. So don't worry about that for right now. All we're really worried about is that this first part of a CSS rule, before the curly brackets, that's called the selector, and that's the title. Selectors, you can make up the names for those if you want. There's only really a couple of rules with coming up with selector names. A, you cannot have spaces in a selector name. Okay, you cannot. Para 1 works fine. Para space 1 does not work. So you can't have spaces in your selector name. Also, you can't start your selector with a number. So dot para 1 works fine. Dot 1 para does not. Okay, we can't do that. You can't start it with a number. So as long as it starts with a letter and doesn't have a space in it, your name should be fine. It is also worth pointing out that CSS is case sensitive. So if you do put uppercase letters in there, you'll need to refer to that later in your HTML. My personal advice is let's just keep all of our selector names lowercase. If you make them all lowercase, then there's no confusion as to where you have to make them uppercase or not. So I like to go ahead and just keep them all lowercase. So the first part is called the selector. Then we have our set of curly brackets, and within that we have what's called properties and values. And I'll copy and paste this a few times because that's precisely what we have up here. We have a property, colon, value, semicolon. Property, colon, value, semicolon. So a CSS rule is made up of 3 parts. A selector, which you'll have one of here at the beginning, and then properties and values, typically 1 per line. Property, value, property, value. Now if we glance up here at the properties and values that we've already created, these are specific. These aren't things that I can make up or that you can make up as we go. These are built into the code. And there's, I don't know, a couple hundred, I think, CSS properties and a large number of values that go with them. But we're looking at 3. Font family, font size, and color. And I probably don't have to do a whole lot of explaining on these 3 for you to figure out what they are. Font family is the font choice that you want. I'm going to try Arial. That's a very common font that just about everybody has. Font size, I'm trying 16 pixels. About 14 pixels is about the default. You can also do PT for points if you're more comfortable using points instead of pixels. I'm going to stick with pixels. And color is broken down into a number, a sign, a pound sign, and then some combination of letters and numbers after that. I'll explain a little bit more about that later, but I can tell you from experience this is going to be kind of a blue color. Now if I save this and look at this in my browser, I don't see anything change. I said para 1, I gave it this definition, but nothing has changed thus far. And that's because CSS kind of exists in two parts. Okay, the CSS code goes up here in the style tag or in its own CSS tag, which we'll do later. I'm going to go ahead and delete this part here. That's just sort of something for me to help explain what this is. But the CSS rule is up here. Now we have to define, or after we've defined this rule, then we have to apply it down in our HTML. When I look down at the HTML in the body tag, I don't see any mention of para 1. Now to apply a CSS class or a CSS rule, we typically go inside of some HTML tag. Okay, for our example here, we've got paragraph tags there, so that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to go inside of that opening paragraph tag and space, and I'll type class equals para 1. Remember from previous lessons that class is an attribute, equals, and then we always put quotes around whatever this value is going to be. Para 1. Notice I do not put the dot in front of it down here in the HTML. Why not? Because that's the syntax difference. In CSS code, it's a different language. Okay, we put a dot, and that tells us that this is something called a class. We have curly brackets, we have semicolons, or colons and semicolons here. Down in your HTML, we have equal signs and quote signs. We don't have the same syntax. So to apply this in HTML, typically you're going to say class equals, and then in quotes put the name of the selector, which is the name of the rule. Para 1 should get us where we want to be. If I save this and look at this in a browser, I can see that there's a change now. There's a change. My font is not the same. It's as the other two paragraphs. It's a sans serif, so it's definitely Arial. I can see that it's a little larger than the default. 16 pixels is what's doing that. And I can see that it's blue. The color of 369 is what's causing that to happen. Now the great thing about CSS is that you can actually reapply this over and over and over again. So if I wanted my third paragraph, I'll skip the second one for now. If I wanted my third paragraph to also look the same, I could just say class equals para 1, save it, look at that in the browser, refresh it, and sure enough that happens. So part of the definition of CSS, the cascading part of Cascading Style Sheet, is that you can actually reapply this over and over and over again. And that's a great thing for us as web designers. If I decided, well, 16 is a little too small for my taste, I'd like to make this a bit larger, I'm going to try to make it 18 pixels. I'll save it, go to my browser and refresh. It changes it in every instance that we've used that rule. So I've used para 1 here on this paragraph. I've used para 1 on this paragraph, and since I've changed it on the rule definition, it changes it in every instance. So whether you've used a rule 1 time, 2 times, 5 times, or 500 times, when you change the rule definition, it changes every instance that you've used it down in your HTML. Let's try another example. Let's look at one more example, a couple more examples. I've made this para 1. Let's make another one here. I'm just going to go after the curly bracket. I'm going to hit enter, and I'll call this para 2. Again, it doesn't really matter what you call it as long as the names match in your HTML and your CSS. So for para 2, I'm going to say the font family is, we got to pick a common font here. Courier. Font size, I'm going to make this really small. I'm going to say 12 pixels. It's kind of tiny. And for color, I know that color works in what's called Rgb values. Typically your numbers go RRGGBB, red, red, green, green, blue, blue. If the number is repetitive in pairs, if it's something like 336699, you can actually condense that and just put 369. There's a number of places to go get all these different color values from. Photoshop has one built into its color palette. You can find numerous web sources on color guides, but let's just eyeball this here, and let's say that I wanted to try to make it red. I know that I need a high value in the first number, so if this is RGB, red, green, blue, I know I need a real high number here and a real low number, if anything, on these two. And I'll just keep it simple and do the 3 values, assuming I'm doing the perfect pairs here. The numbers range from 0 to F. And what that means is we actually have 16 values. We go 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, A, B, C, D, E, F. So instead of being able to do 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, we actually just do A, B, C, D, E, F, and that covers it for us. So assuming that F is the highest number and I want red to be the highest, I'll say F, 0, 0. That means the highest amount of red and no green, no blue, RGB. I don't have a whole lot of color numbers memorized. As a professional, you really won't need to. You can go find your color number somewhere else from the color picker. Mostly in Photoshop is what I use, but you don't have to understand a great detail of this. There's not a lot of numbers you'll need to memorize, but just for convenience sake here, I'm going to say F00. I think that's going to be a red. We called that para 2. That should define it for us. Now we have to go down to a paragraph and we have to tell it to be class equals para 2. I'll do that on my second paragraph. It makes sense to do that. I don't have a style there yet. So class equals para 2. Go back to my browser and refresh it. And it's definitely red. It's definitely smaller. And it looks like it's a different font. Courier is a common font that we use that is sort of like a typewriter font. It's also worth pointing out here at this point, we don't have unlimited resources with fonts at this point in web design. You really have to stick to some common fonts. The fonts that you choose here are going to need to be installed on your end user's computer. Since obviously we have no power over their computer, we have to stick with some common fonts. Arial, Times New Roman, Courier, Comic Sans is common, even though you probably don't want to use Comic Sans. It's just kind of one of those do not use fonts on most designers' lists, just because it's overused and it's not something that looks real serious. Helvetica is typically pretty common. Garamond, Verdana, Tahoma. There's a number of common fonts, and you can certainly Google common web fonts and you'll find that list there. There's probably 15 or 20 of them there. So with font family, you can't just pick anything you want. You do have to pick something that is fairly common for everybody to see. If you pick a font that they don't have, it'll just revert back to the default font, which is Times New Roman in most cases. So, you know, it could affect the way the typography, obviously, of your product, as well as the layout, if the layout is very dependent on the way that the font looks. So let's try it one more time here. Let's make a para 3. Para 3. This time I'll say font, family. Let's try Tahoma. It's going to look a lot like Arial. Font size, 24 pixel. It's going to be the largest one yet. And the color, I'll just pick a random number here. Let's see what we get. I'm going to say 4D9. Red, green, and blue. So a little bit of red, a lot of green, and a medium amount of blue. We'll see what that gives us. I'm not quite sure what to think yet. I'll go down to my third paragraph. Earlier, I'd already put a class of para 1 on there. I'll just change that 1 to a 3. I'll save that. Check this out in a browser. And incredibly ugly, but you see how it works technically. I've got my third paragraph. It's a different font than the other two. It's Tahoma. It's green or bluish green, mostly green, and it's large, 24 pixel. So with CSS, it gives us the capabilities to put some design on here. So we've made 3 CSS rules. A rule as a whole is Oh, and look at that, I made a mistake and didn't even catch myself. I certainly do need that closing curly bracket. It didn't give me an error on my browser because it was the last thing. Had I had another rule after this, that would have given me fits. So it's a good thing that I caught that. But a rule is made up of the selector name, the opening curly bracket, a number of properties and values, property, value, and then a closing curly bracket. Together, all of that makes up what's called a CSS rule, R-U-L-E, rule. There's a lot of properties you can use. We've dealt primarily with typographic properties today, font family, font size, and color. But you can certainly look into the future and see things like colors, background images, borders, spacing, alignments, widths, heights. There's so many CSS properties that we can use that'll help us out. Ultimately, CSS rules like this are going to help us do entire layouts. So we'll look at that towards the future. But for right now, with just 3 properties that we've learned, we can already start to play with our CSS rules quite a bit more and get some real formatting in down here in our design. So CSS, cascading style sheets, it's the way that web designers apply most of the design that we're used to on the web.